Hi everyone. Thank you for coming on this very, very cold day. And thank you, Elizabeth, for coming all the way from Kenosha. So I just wanted to say that Elizabeth is, oh, Shaitan is here. Hi, Shaitan. Elizabeth, I don't know how many people know Elizabeth and heard her speak. She's spoken very many times on issues related to Palestine. She's a professor at UW-Parkside, a history professor, and very knowledgeable about Middle Eastern culture and politics. And she's been here. We've gone to Parkside to listen to her. And she came last year and gave a lovely presentation, and she didn't have time to finish it, so she's back here to the second half. And we all know that there is a so-called ceasefire happening, or whatever it is. So she's going to be addressing that. And welcome.
Thank you.
And thank you all. Just some housekeeping. For those who don't know, the bathroom is down the hall to the right. There's a bathroom. And we have tea and hot chocolate and homemade cookies and crackers and cheese. So please help yourselves. And yeah, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. I just realized I don't have this on slideshow. Okay, so my problem usually is I get stuck in the history part and I don't always make it. I often don't make it as far as I want to. So I'm going to be very short on history today. And I will give you a little bit of history since like 2000, but I'm going to really kind of focus on more current day, the more recent stuff. That said, here's my little proviso. I do want to just point out a couple important facts. I think most of you are pretty familiar with Palestine and Israel already, but in case someone isn't, a couple just very important facts that are usually not stated. Is that, first of all, in 1890, before we start getting Jewish immigration from Russia and Eastern Europe to Palestine, Palestinians were 97% of the population. Okay, that is something that is just almost never acknowledged, at least not in corporate media or people that we often hear. Anti-Semitism, sorry?
Totally invested.
A lot of times anti-Semitism is brought up in the context of this conflict, but anti-Semitism was really a European problem. That it was the whole reason for Zionism in the first place. So that's important to note, is that the reason that Zionism became a movement was because of anti-Semitism in Europe and in Russia, not in the Middle East. In the Middle East, people actually got along very well. We have British rule in Palestine from World War I up until 1948, and I'm going to summarize it by saying Britain, and I'm quoting Avi Schlein there, excuse me, Britain stole Palestine from the Palestinians and gave it to the Zionist movement. That pretty much sums it up. We also have the 1948 war, which for Palestinians is the Nakba, and this is when 750,000 Palestinians were ethnically cleansed from their homes. To create this. This is what Israeli forces did to create the state of Israel. So you can't understand anything about this conflict unless you understand that, because until that issue is dealt with, there will never be peace in the Middle East. So that is something really important to mention. And by the way, the Palestinians, refugees who were expelled, they have never been able to go back, even though the UN passed a resolution in 1949 saying that Palestinians have the right to go back to their homes and as well as get compensation because they lost everything. They've never gotten that. And so they've never gotten compensation of any kind. Then in 1967, we get the 60 War / June War, And this is when Israel conquered the West Bank, Gaza Strip, East Jerusalem, Golan Heights, and the Sinai Peninsula. Guess what, folks? You're not supposed to conquer land anymore up to the UN Charter. It's not, the UN Charter is actually a treaty, and the states are not supposed to use force to take territory. And so after the war, the UN Security Council passed a resolution 242 saying that Israel must withdraw from those territories. And this, so all, to solve this conflict, all we have to do is apply international law. Just, but the Johnson administration didn't make Israel do it. So we have an ongoing occupation up until this day. The third really important piece of history that people need to realize is the blockade on Gaza since 2007. Now, Israel had progressively been closing off Gaza since the 1990s, but this really heightened in 2007 after Hamas won elections in 2006. And so this blockade, and I'll give you some more stats on it, but this was really punishing. By the way, blockades are illegal in international law because it's collective punishment. But that is what led to October 7th. And that's a big part of the context that's often missing. So those are that's my history. I'm just going to give you a couple things before we get to more recent stuff. So after the Oslo Accords and Camp David 2000 fell apart for a variety of reasons, which I am happy to talk about if people want to speak to. We get the second Intifada, which was a lot more violent than the first Intifada. Intifada just means shaking off. This is a revolt against, Palestinian revolt against Israeli rule. Keep in mind that the military rule from 1967 was extremely brutal. Israel kept seizing more and more Palestinian land with settlements, and military court system even imposed on minors. So there are just a lot of reasons for them to want to revolt, and but this one's a lot more bloody. Of course, you have more Palestinians killed than Israelis. We also see the full reoccupation of West Bank cities at this point, because during the Oslo Accords, when Israel was supposed to withdraw from the territories, they instead withdrew to around cities. Now during the second Intifada, they're actually going into cities again. And so we basically have had the far right rule Israel ever since then, and every time we have an election, it's always said, this is the most extreme Israeli government in history, and it just keeps happening every single time. So that's what so this is just kind of an example of how far right Israel has become in its politics and the government. This was a law passed in 2018, and I mean, you could just think of what would happen if this was passed in the United States, but you had Christian instead of Jewish. That doesn't work when you have a multicultural society, right? And it's also emphasizing settlement, which means taking more and more of Palestinian land. All right, so if we look at Gaza from 2005 until 2023, we have an Israeli withdrawal from Gaza. Gaza is a really tiny strip of land. There were about 20 Israeli settlements there before 2005. Israel did withdraw from those, but they did this because they wanted to stall the peace process. And we actually have statements saying this from Israeli prime ministers. So they did withdraw from those settlers from Gaza. However, they then put more settlers, like twice that many settlers that they withdrew into the West Bank. So the whole point of this was to just kind of close off Gaza and focus on the West Bank for settlement. I'm going to talk more about Hamas in just a minute, but these stats give you an idea of how crippling this blockade on Gaza was, because Israel controlled, and it was still considered occupied territory, even though they withdrew, because they were controlling it from without. So they're controlling the borders, the land, the air, the sea, not allowing people to export anything, so the economy just was crushed. And Israeli spokespeople actually said that the reason they were imposing this blockade was to really cripple the economy in hopes that people would rise up against Hamas. Now this is kind of also the thinking or the rationale when sanctions are imposed on countries, if you think about it, is to try to punish the people so they will force the government to change, and it never works. And what ends up happening is the people are the ones who are hurt, and the people in power actually a lot of times get more enriched, at least from sanctions. Not so much in Gaza, but so they can't export. Their economy is just strangled. Their GDP suffers a great deal, and this is all before October 7th. So the blockade since October 7th, 2023, has been even more extreme. The unemployment rate was one of the highest in the world for youth. And by the way, 50% of people in Gaza are under 18, they're children, legally. For the youth, the unemployment is, so we're talking about people in their 20s, 30s, it's like closer to 70%. So, basically their economy was just strangled for the last 20 years. Poverty line, like so many people impoverished, and most of the water, vast majority of the water, 95%, unsafe to drink. So this is just a little bit about the Gaza disengagement and how this is, Sharon said this to the Israeli public to sell the withdrawal from Gaza to the Israeli public. So this is not something he said to an American audience. This was said in Hebrew to an Israeli audience. But he was telling them, he explicitly said this was to freeze the peace process. Okay, and this, I'm putting this one up here. So this guy was Prime Minister Olmert's, one of his main advisors. And he was talking about the blockade of Gaza and saying that the idea was to put Palestinians on a diet. And again, this is, they calculated the number of calories that was necessary for people to not starve. So they wanted, this is before October 7th, they wanted to keep them on the brink of starvation, but not so much so society would collapse. And they also said this was because they wanted people to rise up against Hamas. They thought by punishing the people, they would rise up against Hamas. The logic doesn't really make sense if you think about it. Okay, speaking of Hamas, we just need to talk about it because they are one of the parties to this conflict. So it's important to understand what they actually are and things that have happened that are often not reported. I am, by the way, just a disclaimer, I am not a fan of religion and government put together, so I am not an apologist for Hamas by any means. I will just give you some facts about them. But they emerged during the first Intifada, so this is the first uprising, Palestinian uprising against Israeli military rule in the late 1980s. They consider themselves a national liberation organization with an Islamic flavor to it. They were upset, part of the reason they formed is they were upset that the PLO was putting down their arms. So right around the same time, the PLO had this Palestinian Declaration of Independence in 1988, where they said, we will not use armed resistance anymore. We will accept a Palestinian state in 22% of historic Palestine. So for them, this is a huge concession. It used to all belong to them, and now they're saying we'll take 22%. This is the PLO. And so the PLO are putting down their arms. They're wanting a diplomatic solution because armed resistance has just not gotten them anywhere. So Hamas decides to take up arms with an Islamic bent. Their initial goal, they actually have, I should say, they have participated in nonviolent and armed resistance. So they have kind of used different strategies. But their initial goal was to liberate all of historic Palestine, so meaning Israel as well. Back in the 1980s, late 80s, in the 1990s, they were really against Oslo. Turns out that they had some points to that because Oslo turned out to be a disaster for Palestinians, which I'm happy to go into, but I'm not going to unless there are questions. 2006, they decide to participate in politics, and they decide to run in the elections, and they end up winning. They won by they got a plurality, they got 44%. Most people were voting against the PA. It had to be, more people were voting against something than they were voting for Hamas. Plus, Hamas was smart in in the elections because they had an economic platform. They're saying that we are going to improve the economy. We are going to reform things. We are trustworthy. The PA had a really bad reputation. So the PA is the secular Palestinian authority that they said, basically the PA had made they were corrupt, they made a lot of mistakes. Oslo had been a disaster. Hamas was a change. People were voting for a change. Also, social services. So this is a big reason why Islamist groups get popular in the first place, including Hamas, is because they provide things like education, soup kitchens, health clinics, things that the state is unable or unwilling to provide. So you could say the same thing about the Muslim Brotherhood or Hezbollah. Avi Shlaim, who is a really great Israeli historian and follows all of this extremely closely, he says that the 8 major Israeli assaults on Gaza since 2008, Israel has broken the ceasefire every single time. So this is something that's often not mentioned. Excuse me. And also, they've used what's called the Dahiyya doctrine every single time in every one of these assaults, which means basically using disproportionate force against civilians. We actually have an Israeli major general in 2008 admit this fully. And he was referring to Israel's tactics during the assault on Lebanon in 2006. But this is what Israel has done. And actually, a lot of Palestinians will make the point that this is not really something new. Israel's done this in every war, but now they're like outright admitting to just using disproportionate force against villagers to show them that they should rise up against whatever group Israel doesn't like. Okay. So Hamas, since the 2006 elections, really now that they're in power, they had to focus on governing. However, the US and Israel didn't like the outcome of those elections. And I remember there was a statement by Hillary Clinton saying, like, why did you let them have elections if they were going to win? Anyway, no one, the West was really shocked. I was actually in Jerusalem at the time when this happened. And I remember asking a Palestinian friend, like a Palestinian citizen of Israel, and I said, why did you guys vote for them? And he was like, who were we supposed to vote for? The PA has been a disaster for us. And actually, he couldn't vote, but he's like, who are they? There was no alternative. Like, what else are we supposed to do when the PA has been so corrupt and ineffective and also has been, so anyway. So, where was I going with that? But they actually end up having to focus on governing, the US. So the US and Israel, they convinced the PA to wage a civil war on Hamas and stop them from taking power. And so there ends up being a little civil war in Gaza. So it ends up with Hamas in charge of Gaza and the PA in charge of the West Bank. Hamas actually offered several times a long-term truce to Israel after being elected, which Israel refused to talk to them about. They also had a new charter that they came out, so some of you have probably heard about their initial charter, which was, let's just be clear, it was really awful, had a lot of anti-Semitic phrasing in it. They had been getting flack about this ever since they became a group, so they came out with a new charter in 2017, and it actually had a lot of the things that you would think that Western countries would want. They got very little credit for this, but they accepted a state within, they said if Palestinians voted, had a referendum, and wanted a state within the 67 borders, so West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, we will go with that. We will stay with that as long as that's what the Palestinians want. They said that. They repeatedly emphasized that Hamas and Islam, not that they're trying to kind of conflate the two, which is not accurate. But they said we embrace tolerance, moderation, and opposition to all forms of oppression, including based on religion, ethnicity, gender, or citizenship. There's actually no anti-Jewish rhetoric in this new charter, and they clearly distinguish between Judaism and Zionism, which I think is important. They also emphasize that Hamas is a democratic player. And they have a whole article devoted to women as having played a pivotal, and I'm quoting, pivotal role in resistance, liberation, and building a political order. So this new charter, I think they thought would help their image in the West. I mean, this is of course way before October 7th. But there was very little attention paid to it. I mentioned that there have been several ceasefires between Hamas and Israel every time there's been an Israeli assault in Gaza. Prisoner exchanges are often part of that. The rockets, usually heard about rockets fired from Gaza into Israel. These things are homemade rockets. obviously lack guidance systems. There's not, so they can't, by definition, can't really be discriminating because they are, don't have guidance systems. Not smart, in my opinion, to fire them in Israel, but those are the kind of weapons we're talking about that they're using. However, most of the time they were from other groups because Hamas realized it's always a disaster when Israel bombs back. Of course, there were those 8 occasions in which Hamas did respond. Okay, I'm not going to talk about this because this was the first Israeli assault on Gaza back in December 2008 to January 2009. We all thought this was horrendous with 1,400 Palestinians killed. And that, I mean, today that's like, 2 months in Gaza. I'm actually not going to talk about this because I don't have time. But if someone has a question, I'll respond to it. This kind of gives you an idea of how many Palestinians were killed from 2008 up into 2023. And a lot of them civilians, the vast majority of actually the civilians versus Israelis. And then if we look at Gaza right before October 7th, we still have 50% children. We still have so I don't think I've mentioned this before, 80% of Gaza's population are refugees from the Nakba, or descendants of refugees. Meaning that, after the Nakba, about 300,000 Palestinians were forced into Gaza. And so this population is largely refugee. And a lot of them can see their former homes, like not that far away, right across the border. Anyway, water, food insecurity, so 80% of the population was reliant on aid from the UN and other aid organizations. I talked about the unemployment. 500,000 kids were in need of mental health support. This is before October 7th. 500,000 kids in need of, because of all the assaults. Another interesting thing that I realized I learned recently is that observers since the 1950s had been referring to Gaza as a concentration camp. And again, this is like before the last 2 and some years. If you look back to like a UN official in the early 1950s, they called it a huge concentration camp. Al Gore's father, after the '67 war, went to Gaza and came back and told Congress that it's a huge concentration camp. On the stand. We've had Israelis also say this. So Barak Kimmerlein, who's an Israeli sociologist, in 2002 described Gaza as the biggest concentration camp ever seen. Giora Island, who was a former general in 2004, in conversation with an American official, said Gaza is a huge concentration. So this is even before the blockade, all these descriptions. Okay. Another thing to mention is, so there was the Aerobarometer is a polling, they did do a ton of polling in the Middle East organization, and they had been in Gaza and the West Bank right before October 7th, like weeks before, and they had talked to Palestinians in the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, and asked them, who would you vote for if there were elections held? And 67% of them said they had no to little trust in Hamas. Okay, so Palestinians were actually not supportive of Hamas before October 7th. And by the way, none of them knew about October 7th. This was like not even within Hamas, only a very small group of people knew about it, and only a very small number of people participated in it, in the crimes. So like we're talking of 1,500 people out of a really big organization. So sometimes people say, well, why didn't Hamas try nonviolent resistance? And I've already given you a couple examples, again, not defending them, but just stating facts. I've already given you some examples when they actually did. And other Palestinians, of course, have long used nonviolent resistance. The first Intifada was essentially nonviolent resistance. This is like the late 80s and 90s, even before that as well. Oslo, I think you can think about Camp David as efforts of nonviolent diplomacy. I mentioned how Hamas offered truces to Israel. The new charter I mentioned. Another thing is after every Israeli assault in Gaza from 2008, there was always a UN Commission of Inquiry that came to Gaza and tried to assess the situation, who did what, who should we say bad Israel, bad Hamas, also human rights groups. And Hamas actually cooperated with these efforts, even though they were very hard, like the UN reports were quite hard on Hamas, actually. Harder on Israel because Israel killed far more people and destroyed much of Gaza. But, and then the last quick example I'll give you is the Great March of Return. This was in 2018, lasted for about a year and a half. And this was a grassroots, nonviolent movement to walk to the fence, so Gaza is separated with the fence, and call for the right to return. So this was overwhelmingly nonviolent. People would actually go and picnic and have there was music and dancing, and they kind of made a big, festival out of it. Very few incidents of. There were a couple of youth threw Molotov cocktails at the fence, but overwhelmingly nonviolent. And first of all, they were doing this for media attention, right? They wanted the international press to cover it. It did not get very much coverage. Even people who follow this, like the Middle East, weren't really paying attention to it very much. In the process, Israeli troops, they on the watchtowers they killed about 250 to 300 Palestinians who were peacefully just walking and being nonviolent. Also about 36,000 people maimed because the Israeli snipers aimed for their knees and their ankles, so deliberately maiming people. So I think that's quite a bit of evidence that there were attempts at nonviolent resistance. And actually, Al Jazeera has some really good documentaries on October 7th, as well as Israeli war crimes during October, in the months after. In one of them, a Hamas spokesperson said that after they tried the Great March, Hamas did not organize it, but they did participate. They actually supported it, and they did help bus people to the fence and that kind of things. But they didn't start it, but they did support it. But they said after the pretty brutal crackdown, they thought, what else are we going to do? Now, I totally disagree with what they decided to do, but this is part of why they did what they did. One other thing. Sometimes we hear, where's Palestinian Mandela? Well, there have been actually a lot of them, and a lot of them have been either in prison or exiled or killed by Israel. A really good example is Marwan Barghouti, who's been in prison by Israel since 2002. And they love to do polls in this part of the world, and every time they ask Palestinians who you would vote for, he's always at the top. So he's extremely popular. He is extremely moderate. He tells people don't target civilians ever. He's for women's rights. I mean, his wife has been a heroic defender of his, trying to get him out of prison, and also women's rights. It seems like a no-brainer that you would let him out of jail and let him be a leader for Palestinians. And in fact, there have been a lot of Israelis, Israeli officials, even a former Shin Bet official. There have been a lot of people advocating for his release. But he's still in prison. And if you wanted me to tell you why, so when he was on trial, he didn't launch a defense because he was protesting the illegitimate court that he was tried in. And I can tell you more about that if you want, but let me just address this one point. Why is he still in prison? I mean, because he could unite Palestinians. That is the reason he is still in prison, because he could be that person, he could be that Mandela to unite Palestinians. Because, there are a lot of divisions within Palestinian society, partly because they live apart from each other. They can't even, it's really hard for them to even see each other, although the internet has helped. But he could bring national unity and leadership, and that is the last thing that Bibi Netanyahu wants, or I would argue most Israeli governments. Okay, so I'm not going to talk about this very much, about October 7th. I mean, I just one just really quick point is that it started out attacking military installations and bases, and then it devolved into war crimes. Okay, so but Hamas claims that the intent was to capture soldiers so they could exchange them for Palestinian prisoners, which they've done in the past. And then just kind of all hell broke loose, and that was not the plan. But why then? I mean, the long-standing issues are the Nakba, the occupation, the blockade, right? Again, Palestinian prisoners was a major incentive because they wanted to capture Israeli soldiers. And by the way, they were not supposed to capture civilians. That was not the plan, and it was extremely unfortunate that that happened. Settler violence was on the rise into 2023, so are we all familiar with settlements and settlers? Hopefully, okay. Raise your hand, let me know, and I'll tell you about settlements if you want at the end. Settler violence was on the rise in the West Bank that year, and now it's even, I mean, it has just escalated so much this past year. I mean, the last count I saw was like 850 settler and IDF attacks on Palestinians in the West Bank, and over 1,000 killed in the last 2 years, Palestinians. All opposite raids have been happening, the IDF going up into all the noble sanctuary on the Temple Mount, and attacking Palestinians praying. Normalization with Arab states is another one. So you probably all heard about the Abraham Accords from 2020 in Trump's first term. Can you believe it's only 1 year into a second term? I'm just like exhausted already. Anyway, yeah, so in his first term, you had these normalizations. So we're talking Bahrain, UAE, Morocco, Sudan. And there was talk that Saudi Arabia was next, getting close to October 7th. That would be a disaster for Palestinians. Because the problem with these normalizations is, first of all, they're not so much, they are diplomatic relations, but they are also arms deals. So a lot of them are signing up for this so they can buy fancy US weapons, right? So they get US weapons, but they have to, the price is they have to normalize with Israel. And the other part is Palestinians are abandoned. So for years and years, many decades, ever since '67, Arab states refused to normalize with Israel unless Palestinians got something, like a state or basically, unless Palestinians had a resolution, unless there was a just resolution to their plight, right? And now these normalizations are just cutting them out, and there's nothing for them. So with Saudi Arabia, who is the biggest power in the region, is reportedly almost signing, and who knows if they would have signed it, and who knows if Congress would have approved it. But the fact that that was, talked about made Hamas was not happy about that. I mean, all Palestinians were not happy about that. Hamas has also talked about shattering the status quo because Palestinians were not on the world agenda. They felt basically forgotten about in Gaza. Again, Palestinians feel that way, Hamas feels that way, doesn't mean everyone supports what Hamas did. A couple things that were not reported is Hamas did offer on, I believe it was on October 8th, they offered to release all the civilian hostages in exchange for a ceasefire and a commitment for Israel not to invade, like ground invasion. And Bibi said no. Netanyahu said no. Early on in the war/genocide, whatever we're going to call it, we'll talk about that in a minute, but early on, so we're talking within a week or two, Hamas issued a document stating it had given strict instructions to only attack military installations and military targets, and not to attack civilians, and they said things got out of hand, which, that's kind of an understatement. But they also said, we are willing to have an international body come investigate, we will punish our people who are responsible. Israel has not allowed an international investigation of any kind, even an Israeli investigation. Netanyahu, that's bad for him. And Israel, of course, has not allowed foreign journalists into Gaza as well, to this day. And the Supreme Court keeps on pushing it off. Like there's been something in the Supreme Court for over a year now trying to get foreign journalists in. Palestinian journalists, however, have been heroic. Getting us the information, right? Unfortunately, our corporate media seems to think that it has to be one of their people in there to do the job, even though Palestinian journalists have been. I mean, it would be good to have more journalists in, for sure, just because we'd have more eyes on the ground and just more attention to, because Gaza, it's off the headlines now, right? I mean, ever since the ceasefire, it really hasn't been talked about. How am I doing at time? 7:37. Okay, I have a little more time, and then I promise I will get to look at like ceasefire stuff. Okay, just if you haven't heard about the Hannibal Directive, check it out. Haaretz had a big expose. This is basically Israel killing a bunch of its, preferring to kill its own soldiers, and then that was extended to civilians on October 7th, so they couldn't go back to Gaza, so no one would be captured by Hamas. Widely reported in Israeli press, hardly mentioned. I don't even know if it's mentioned in U.S. press. Okay, so stats on Gaza today. So the blue is like as of yesterday. The rest of the stats I was unable to update because I couldn't find more stats for any of it. But Gaza has just been utterly destroyed. Every single hospital attacked, and many of them demolished. Only a handful partially operating. 92% of homes destroyed. 71,000. And I'll tell you in just a sec why those stats are actually low. This is a low count. The children one, I haven't been able to, that children stat is from like a year ago. So the children stat has got to be thousands more. And let's see, child amputees, the most child amputees anywhere in the world. And Gaza is a tiny place. That's the other thing with these stats. With the journalists, almost 300 journalists killed. And we know Israel has been attacking them, going after them to attack them because they take credit for it. They say we killed a terrorist, even though no evidence ever is presented. Over 500 aid workers. These are all record numbers for conflicts. And again, Gaza is this tiny little area with a population used to be 2.3 million. Now it's probably closer to 2. The health workers killed. Health workers were not wearing their scrubs to work because they knew they were being targeted. The starvation, I haven't been able to update that stat. That is from October, I think. Israeli captives were all returned with the so-called ceasefire. And then the body of the last one just Monday. That, by the way, that's the only heavy equipment Israel let into Gaza so they could look for Israeli bodies. They wouldn't let any other heavy equipment in for Palestinians to remove all the rubble, 61,000 tons of rubble. We still have over 9,000 Palestinians who are, a lot of them are really hostages because they're kidnapped from their homes in the middle of the night. A lot of them are on administrative detention, which means they're not charged with a crime. And so there's usually between 9,000 and 10,000 Palestinians in Israeli detention at any time, and at least a third are usually there for administrative detention, which means they're not charged with anything. So they're just held, and it can be indefinitely. And they're tortured. I hate talking about torture, but I will talk about it in a few minutes if I have time. Because, by the way, the UN Committee on Torture just met a couple months ago, and 25 different 25 different human rights groups had submitted reports, and it is really awful, just the amount of torture that's going on in Israeli prisons. Also, between 500 and 700 children, Palestinian children, are put through the military court system every single year, and they're treated as adults. Israel actually considers any kid over 12 to be an adult and treats them accordingly. Okay, but back to the death count. So when you hear about the Gaza Health Ministry, they actually, in past conflicts or past Israeli assaults on Gaza, Israel has used their stats. The U.S. intelligence finds their stats credible. And we know that these stats are actually very low because they only count direct deaths. Okay, they only count people who have been killed by a bomb or a sniper or a quadcopter. They only count direct deaths. They're not counting people who die from exposure. They're not counting people who die. Even if you were wounded in an attack and then die a couple days later, they don't count that. So it's only direct deaths. They also have to have complete identification, including there's a certain number that Israel assigns to them. So they have to have their full name, their number. They have to have also made it to a hospital and put in the morgue in the hospital. A lot of people don't go to, like a lot of families are just burying their loved ones wherever they are. So a lot of the foreign doctors who've gone into Gaza over the last couple of years, you've probably heard some of them, they say this has got to be, like, a lot of people are just not even making it to the hospitals. So they only count those. So that does not include the thousands under the rubble, death from disease, and Israel's blocking a lot of medications going to Gaza. So death from lack of health care, death from starvation. So they're not counting anything unless it's a direct hit and full identification and they make it to a hospital. So these numbers have got to be super low. Okay, Israel actually, I don't know if you guys saw this. This came out, gosh, sometime in the fall. So this is from Plus the 972, which is a great joint Israeli-Palestinian media outlet. They do investigative work, and I really highly recommend it. I think Yuval Abraham, who also did the lavender story that I don't have time to talk about, but it just talks about the Israel's use of AI and their targeting. That's why they were able to demolish so much of Gaza so quickly. But this is an Israeli army database saying that Israel's killed 83% civilians. This is Israeli numbers, okay? And so Yuval Abraham, when he's talked about this article, has said the number is likely much higher, probably in the 90s, which is consistent only with places where there's been genocide. But I don't have time to talk. So, let's see. Okay. This is just about the journalists. So more journalists killed than in like the wars over the last 100 years combined. The starvation is pretty straightforward. Israel's just not letting the food in. And they told us they were going to do this, okay? Yoav Gallant, who is an indicted war criminal, or at least there's a warrant out for his arrest, he said this. He said, we are cutting off food, water, medicine, fuel. And so what I don't understand is why people can still deny that there was an intent when we have so many statements like this. So many. Just look at South Africa's genocide case against Israel. It's pages and pages and pages of statements like this. But this is what they did. And then if you look at the trucks, so remember they calculated the number of calories needed back in 2008? So we know that in Gaza they need like 600 trucks a day just to not starve. So that would be about right here, between 500 and 600. And this is what got through in the first, I guess this is just like the first several months. But these stats are pretty consistent over the last 2 years and 4 months. So the trucks, they're just not, and by the way, since the ceasefire, the average has been 148 trucks, I believe, something like that. Well under 600 as Israel was supposed to let in. Plus, Doctors Without Borders has said they really need more like 1,000 trucks at this point because the need is so great at this moment. Okay, so I'm going to move on. And how much time should I leave for questions? Like stop around 7? Is that good?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I want to talk about human shields because it's just you hear it all the time. And I'm going to give you some points that you can say. As well as, so for the genocide stuff, like just check out Amnesty International's genocide report. Or South Africa's case. Oh, I did want to talk about polls too. Okay, I did say I would talk about this too. I might run out of time again. You know I always run out of time. But I think it is useful to look at polls of Palestinians and Israelis. So this one was done by a Palestinian polling agency. I heard this on a 972 podcast in October, and they'd done it recently. Palestinians, so you heard about all these states recognizing Palestine, right? So this is before Trump got his ceasefire, and I think the good news about European states recognizing Palestine is the reason they did it. They did it because they were pressured by their people, right? You had people out on the streets demanding them do something, and they're like, what's the least thing we can do? What's the lowest bar we can do? Recognize Palestine. But the fact that they were pressured to do that shows that pressure works, right? Pressure really does work. But anyway, so this is in response to that. Palestinians responded positively to more states recognizing their right to statehood. So 2/3 think it's desirable. Only about 35% thought it was very useful. I mean, I gotta admit, I don't think it's super useful. 32% say desirable, but not enough. As far as what they want for the future, this is the whole one state, two state thing. So advocates of one state want, I mean, Israel already controls all of it, right? From the river to the sea, Israel controls all of it. So people who want a one state solution think there should just be equal rights for everyone. And Palestinians who right now have no rights in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, Gaza, a little bit more in East Jerusalem, but really no rights in the West Bank and Gaza should have equal rights, basically be given citizenship. So as far as the one state, two state thing, support for these solutions has increased, and the pollsters said this is because Palestinians want anything that will stop the bloodshed. So this was still before the ceasefire. I mean, the one good thing with this ceasefire is you're not seeing hundreds of people killed every day. It's more like tens of people every day. But that's obviously still bad. But better than before. In Gaza, a majority of people will accept either, but a two-state is much more favorable. I think they just probably have a hard time believing that in a one state they're going to get equal treatment. Most Palestinians want democracy. 70%, and I can, if anyone wants to hear this or hear this podcast and they have a transcript too, just email me, I'll send it to you. But it's one of the 972 polls, from this outlet. Most want democracy. 70% say when they're asked what type of government they want. And when asked about the role of religion in the state, most want a secular state. As far as factions, so we're talking not just Hamas, but also Fatah, which is the PA's group, Mahmoud Abbas's group, and then there's a bunch more. But as far as the factions, even before the war, none of them were popular. There was not a single party with strong popularity. And in fact, when people were asked recently about political parties, 39% gave a 0 to every single party. So they have no faith in any of their parties. Although unity is what they want. The most common answer to who do you want to rule you was a unity government. So that is the one they really, and they need, again, Barghouti seems like a no-brainer to let him out so he can be that unifier. Okay, and also the biggest proportion of people on the factions question said we vote for independent people or for new voices. So again, they're just tired of the old parties. This is interesting. When asked about the most preferred way of achieving liberation, so ending the occupation, etc., Palestinians mention peaceful methods. They start with BDS, so the boycott, divest, sanction movement. Then peaceful protests or negotiations, those are what they first mentioned. So armed resistance is not in the top 3 because they haven't achieved much with it. But it's a sensitive topic because a lot of Palestinians say that, they have the right to fight the occupation. They actually have the right to use armed resistance against military targets and soldiers. That's their right under international law, they know that. So they realize that they want to make sure you know they have the right to fight the occupation under international law, but also from a practical perspective, is that the best approach? And a lot of people don't think so. So I thought that was super interesting. Okay, brace yourself for this one. This one is, the polls of Israelis are grim. Now, I have heard some Israeli analysts claim that because they're wartime polls, you should take them with a grain of salt. However, these have been really consistent, like over this whole 2-some years. So I don't know. I hope they're right. I hope that these are not accurate, but they're devastating, because consistently 95% of Jewish Israelis thought that Israel was using just the right amount of force or not enough force. This is from early on after October 7th, when Gaza was just being blown to bits. 95% of Jewish Israelis. And so this is kind of like, I wasn't expecting the numbers to be this high. So this was hard for me. Because it's hard to wrap your head around, how do you have a solution when you have attitudes like this, right? There was also a poll in August 2025, just 6 months ago. This was an Israeli poll from the Israel Democracy Institute that said 79% of Jewish Israelis are not troubled by the starvation of Palestinians in Gaza. 79%. And then the question was, to what extent are you personally troubled or not troubled by the reports of famine and suffering amongst the Palestinian population of Gaza? And 55% said not at all troubled, was their answer. There was also a June poll that said 75% of Jewish Israelis highly agree that there are no innocents in Gaza. 50% of them are children. I don't know if people are telling them that, but that was also devastating to hear. And then the ones on the right here, this was a Penn State poll done by, it was reported in Haaretz. Some of you might have seen this one too, where 82% of Jewish Israelis supported the forced expulsion of Gaza residents. And the same poll said 56 of Jewish Israelis supported the forced expulsion of the Palestinian citizens of Israel, even. And the thing is, the youth actually have worse number in Israel. So Israel has like the reverse trend that you see in a lot of societies, where in a lot of societies the youth tend to be more progressive, not always, but sometimes you see the youth being more progressive than their parents. In Israel, it's the opposite. The youth are actually more extremist than their parents. So youth said, so we're talking about 40 and under supported, 66% of 40 and under Israeli Jews supported expelling Palestinian citizens. So it was like 10% more. Okay, and then you also have this 47% agree basically to genocide. That's how the question was stated. When conquering an enemy city, IDF should kill all the inhabitants. But that's the Amalek story that Bibi mentioned a couple times and other politicians mentioned a couple times. Okay, so I don't know. I really hope this is just wartime awfulness, but a lot of Israelis are talking about like as if the whole thing is just over now, even though Palestinians are still pretty much living under the same conditions. Okay. I don't want to get into torture. It's just like, I'm going to break down. Beit Salem has a really important torture report from last year. It was in July 2024, called Welcome to Hell. So Beit Salem is the leading Israeli human rights group. So check that out if you want to hear really awful stuff. Also the UN Committee on Torture report recently. Okay. Do I have time to talk about human shields and how you can't use that excuse if you're Israel? Okay, so you always hear about human shields, right? Let me just mention the definition is intentional co-location of military objects and citizens with the specific intent of trying to prevent the targeting of those military objectives. Okay, so there has to be intent to put people next to military objectives with the intent of trying to not get those military objectives hit. The classic case is when soldiers force civilians from the other side to walk ahead of them in the battle zone, right? In hopes that the enemy is not going to shoot at their soldiers. So Israel claims human shields like every time there is a mass civilian casualty event. Even though Palestinians have not been compelled, Palestinians haven't been compelled by Hamas to be anywhere, nor have they volunteered to shield anyone. And despite that, there's usually no legitimate military objective in cases where Israel makes this claim. So let me just make a few points. The mere presence of civilians, the mere presence of armed forces or fighters in civilian areas does not mean the enemy is using the human shield. So you can't just say, well, Hamas fights in Gaza, so we can just bomb anywhere we want. By the way, Israel's military command and control center is in the middle of Tel Aviv. Same thing with other, and that's not the only one. They do have most of their command centers in the middle of civilian populations, and we don't think that they're able to just be bombed at will. Also, the logic of human shields rests on deterrence, which doesn't really work when Israel indiscriminately has bombed everything in Gaza, right? So there's no deterrence there for them. Israel's also used them for decades in the West Bank and Gaza, forcing a Palestinian civilian to go ahead of them when entering a house. The Supreme Court said they had to stop doing this somewhere in the early 2000s. After every major Israeli assault on Gaza since 2008, human rights groups investigated and found that Israel was using them in these cases too. And then in the last 2 years, Haaretz found that Israel's been regularly using human shields to go into tunnels in front of them to clear out tunnels or buildings, so using human shields. And nearly every unit has one of, they keep a Palestinian on, force them to stay with them for months, and they call them mosquitoes. So there are reports of Palestinians being forced to be a human shield for months for a certain unit, and every unit has one. And actually, Israeli soldiers have also made kind of whistleblowing claims about this too. So Palestinian groups generally don't use human shields, whereas Israel has a long history of using them. So I don't know if you can read this, but Israel used to hide arms in synagogues before they got their state. When it was still the British period, they used to hide arms in schools and synagogues. And if you go around Tel Aviv, you will see about 50 plaques like this talking about how they used to store their arms in the synagogue or the school. So just another point. Nate Gordon has talked about this in the London Review of Books. Okay, I still haven't talked about the most recent stuff. Should we take questions, or do you guys want me to talk about the ceasefire stuff a little bit? Should I go on a little bit, or does anyone have questions yet? Okay, I knew this would happen. I always have too much. Okay, so first of all, why was there this ceasefire in the first place? And what is happening with that? The why is pretty easy. Arab states finally came up with a backbone after Israel bombed Doha in Qatar. Do you guys remember that? Like September 9th or 10th, something like that. The reason why this was such a big wake-up call for them is Qatar is a very important U.S. ally. Our biggest base in the Middle East is based there, and Israel still bombed it, and they're our biggest ally in the Middle East. So Arab states finally demanded that Trump do something about Israel's assault, genocide on Gaza. By the way, Hamas was in Doha because at the request of the US and Israel, because that's where their negotiators were. So you had Hamas negotiators in Doha, and they were actually discussing most recent plan of Trump's. So we were there at the request to discuss the ceasefire proposal, the latest ceasefire proposal, and then Israel bombed them. So the Arab states were just like, that's not cool. Now Israel's bombing like good allies of the US. So the Arab states pressured Trump to do something. Mostly, and I think it's mostly just to get it off the headlines, because they also have a lot of, even dictators have to deal with populations and have to deal with people being upset about Palestinians being slaughtered in Gaza. So I think they wanted it off the front pages. But the ceasefire has not ended the genocide. Now it's a slower genocide, is what's been happening. So Israel continues to make life unlivable in Gaza for Palestinians, or they're trying to. So they're still killing. There's almost 500 Palestinians killed since the ceasefire went into effect on October 11th, and over 1,300 wounded. And this is a big deal because the healthcare system has been destroyed, right? And there's 20,000 Palestinians who are in urgent need of medical care they can't get in Gaza because the healthcare system has been destroyed. The Rafah border crossing, I have not checked the news today because I was at school all day, but I don't think the Rafah border crossing is supposed to be opened up very soon. We'll see if it happens. Both ways, it's supposed to be open in and out. Israel's still forbidding international journalists, talked about that. Also, more and more foreign doctors are having trouble getting in. Some of you might have know about Feroz Sidwat. Did I say his name right? You know him? He was all over the media. I'm sure they didn't want him going back in. He wasn't able to go back in. I've heard, this is kind of anecdotally, but I've heard several foreign doctors not able to go back. And journalists, of course, no foreign journalists. Again, they're still tightly restricting aid. The shelter items are just not getting in, and it is winter. There has been flooding. We've had 10 Palestinian children die of exposure to the cold, and there is all this stuff piled up at the border, and Israel just won't let it in. You have all the things they need. They have all the food they need, all the shelter they need, and it's not getting in because Israel won't let it in, and Trump is not making them let it in. Nutrition, but a lot of the food that's getting in is not nutritious food, it's like junk food, and it's expensive. So that even the stuff that's getting in is not really what they really need. And Bibi has just announced, a couple days ago, he said he will not allow reconstruction anytime soon until the captive's body was returned. But he also said not until Hamas is disarmed and Gaza is demilitarized will he allow reconstruction to start. Also, what's been happening just on January 1st, you guys might have heard that Israel effectively banned 37 aid groups from operating in Gaza. Deanna Butu had a piece in Zateo about this recently, including Doctors Without Borders. I don't know of any country in the world that's ever banned Doctors Without Borders. The Norwegian Aid Council, International Rescue Committee, World Vision, Handicap International. So these are organizations that provide desperately needed health care. They have been able, when they can, they send in doctors. Water, Israel's destroyed the water and sanitation infrastructure. Food, when they're allowed to. Shelter, again, when allowed to. Israel's destroyed over 92% of housing. And that stat is from about a year ago, so it's probably much higher now. I mean, people are living in the rubble. And these tents that are just, barely functioning, not functioning. Also education, these groups provide education for children and prosthetics to all the people who have lost limbs. So why this amounts to a ban, so Israel basically has put on new requirements for aid groups, and it effectively is banning them because Israel's now requiring detailed information about all the staff, Palestinian and foreign staff. This is very dangerous because Israel's killed over 500 aid workers, right? So it's just dangerous to give them that information. And again, that's a world record. Registration will also be denied. Israel is denying registration if the organization or any employee does not recognize Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. And of course, the problem with that is 20% of Israel's population are in fact Palestinian. And it's not democratic because those Palestinians are basically second-class citizens, and plus Israel occupies, you know, all that. Okay, if someone has called for a boycott of Israel in the last 7 years, or if they have promoted delegitimization campaigns of Israel against Israel, like saying what Israel does, expressing support for legal cases against Israeli citizens, or before the International Criminal Court. So, you know, especially the requirement about giving them all the information about the workers. That is a deal breaker for these organizations because they don't want their workers to be targeted. And so, and why is Israel doing this? They don't want more foreign witnesses to what's happening, right? And this is part of a larger trend. You know, Israel went after UNRWA. The day that South Africa, well, they've been doing this for years, but the day South Africa gave its application, the genocide case against Israel to the ICJ, that same day is when Israel made the claim about 13 members of Hamas working for UNRWA. And they've never provided evidence of it. No, they can substantiate it at all. So every UNRWA donor has, you know, they've then started funding UNRWA again, except the US, because I think Congress passed something against it. Anyway, well, I think Trump has basically stopped giving money to any UN body at this point. Also, the ICJ ruled that there was no evidence against UNRWA, against Hamas like infiltrating UNRWA, and that Israel should cooperate to allow UNRWA to do its work. That was like one of its more recent rulings. And instead, Israel demolished UNRWA's headquarters in East Jerusalem just recently, like 10 days ago. The U.S. has also been part of this. The U.S. imposed sanctions on 3 Palestinian NGOs just for pushing for Israel to be held accountable at the ICC, International Criminal Court. Okay. Do you want me to talk about Trump's plan, the 20-point plan? Okay.
Yeah.
I don't see it going anywhere. I really don't. I mean, okay, so it had, and this is what the UN Security Council basically also signed on to. Only China and Russia vetoed it because they felt, this is what they said, well, because you got all these Arab states signed on to it, and the PA said that the Palestinian Authority was okay with it. I don't know why no one has a backbone, but anyway, there were kind of 3 buckets, like kind of 3 categories to this 20. These are bullet points. This is not a plan, by the way. Mostly, it laid out a ceasefire, right? Like, so a lot of it dealt with just a ceasefire, supposedly, at least Palestinians not firing on Israel, and a captives exchange. So Israel got all their living captives back, and they most recently got their last deceased captive. But there's still over 9,000 Palestinians, and Palestinians did get almost 2,000 prisoners released, or I should call them captives, because again, a lot of them are just have no due process. And when they do have due process, often a kangaroo court that is not really fair. But anyway, so you have the ceasefire captive exchange. Then you have like the withdrawal. Israel's supposed to withdraw. They're still controlling 53% of Gaza right now, that yellow line. And they've been putting up these big cement blocks across the yellow line. They've been digging trenches. I had a go to Dropsite News. They did a recent report with forensic architecture, and you can see from space from a satellite where all the military installations are. So they've mapped out Israel has almost 50 military outposts or bases in the part of Gaza that they control. It's looking like they're trying to make it permanent, is what it's looking like. Okay, but you're supposed to have a withdrawal, and then you're supposed to have this international, what is it called? ISF, international, what is it called? Like the troops to take over for Gaza. It's like security force, is that what it was? Okay. They're supposed to take over Gaza, the part that Israel withdrew from. There's a very vague reference to a peace solution with many provisos. So I'm quoting from this thing now, when the PA reform program is carried out, the conditions may be in place for a pathway to Palestinian self-determination and statehood. So it's very vague, very, very vague on specifics as far as what Palestinians get from this. And really, it's definitely not a peace plan at all. And it also referenced the Board of Peace, which I'll get into in a sec. But the major issues with this is there's no accountability for Israel for committing genocide. Israel doesn't have to pay for the reconstruction. Israel just destroyed Gaza and took out 2,700 Gazan families, whole extended families, plus 71,000 people plus. And they don't have, there's no accountability for that. So they're not paying for the reconstruction of Gaza. The Gulf states apparently get to pay for this. And Trump is making people pay $1 billion to be on his Board of Peace if they're not invited or if they want a permanent seat. So maybe that's supposed to pay for reconstruction, I guess. So typically after genocide, you'll have truth and reconciliation commissions, like think about Rwanda, for example. If there's a genuine effort to really want to create lasting conditions for peace, they're not doing this here. In fact, Bibi is invited onto the Board of Peace, right? Also, Trump's very first point in this 20-point thing calls for de-radicalization of Gaza. What about Israel? Look, think about those polls I just told you about Israel. There's nothing about de-radicalization of Israel. Plus, there's nothing about the roots of the Nakba and the need to end to this brutal occupation and apartheid. Nothing about justice, so reparations, nothing about that. So if you really want if you actually want a peace plan, you have to have justice for past wrongs. You have to have freedom, equality, have to be part of that. The whole thing just smacks of colonialism, right? It reminds me of the British Mandate 100 years before, because they're fully in charge of everything, whether it's the executive functioning, legislative, judicial, it's all under Trump, God help us. Emphasis on disarmament. So you can tell that we know that Israel got to go in there and edit his initial plan that the Arab states got him to come out with, but we never saw it. But it's clear that Israel we know Bibi and one of his advisors sat down with Trump after the Arabs had their input. They got rid, so there used to be 21 points, and Trump got rid of the one saying that West Bank can't be annexed, because clearly Bibi didn't want that there. There's also a big emphasis on disarmament of Hamas and demilitarization of Gaza. This just gives Israel an excuse to delay, to derail any progress, because it's almost impossible. If Israel couldn't get Hamas to disarm after 2+ years of genocide, why does it think they're going to just give up their weapons now? Hamas has said that they're willing to consider decommissioning, so burying their weapons. So Jeremy Scahill from Jobsite News has talked to a lot of them just to see because you can't know what's going on unless you talk to everyone. They are willing to consider things like that. They say they don't have the authority to force other groups to disarm, and they probably can't practically. But I think that disarmament is just like an excuse for Israel to not do their end of things. Also, why is Israel able to demand Hamas to disarm when they're the ones who carried out the genocide? There's no calls for Israel to disarm. I think actually everyone should disarm, but that's just me. Israel, by the way, did not want this plan at first. This is something Bibi really was not a fan of, but he was, like I said, was able to edit it a great deal. He also clearly added that the withdrawal, the IDF withdrawal to then be taken over by the ISF, would be based on, I'm quoting from it, based on standards, milestones, and timeframes linked to demilitarization. So again, this demilitarization thing is just an excuse to not do whatever they don't want to do. Okay, so again, Rafah border is supposed to be opening soon. We'll see if that happens. Only to foot traffic. Hopefully those 20,000 Palestinians who desperately need health care outside of Gaza can do that. But I don't think there's any guarantee they'll get to come back at some point, but they're supposed to be able to.
And you mentioned in the beginning, something needs to be done. I don't know what you meant by that. What needs to be done to stop that situation?
For Gaza?
Gaza
I mean, I think Israel's not going to stop what they're doing without pressure. So I think there has to be international pressure, and governments are not going to pressure. Governments are going to. They have to change their relationship with Israel in order for there to be. I mean, Israelis are actually already feeling some pressure, and I don't know how many of you have heard Shir Haber talk. He used to be part of the BDS. He's Israeli, but he's now in Germany. He's part of BDS. He used to be part of BDS. But he focuses on the economic aspects, and he claims that the economy in Israel is not doing well right now at all. And a lot of it is because like this enormous spending on demolishing Gaza, plus all the reservists they've had to use. By the way, a lot of reservists stopped showing up. So 972 does a good job talking about this too. I think last April, 972 said 100,000 reservists just stopped coming. They just didn't show up. And Israelis, when they go abroad, they're also, something that matters to Israelis is cultural stuff. Like if they got banned from the Olympics, if they couldn't participate in those European soccer leagues, if they couldn't be part of Eurovision, that would matter to them. Like that mattered to South Africa. That is what pushed. And by the way, we should be a little more optimistic because South Africa, no one ever thought apartheid would ever end in South Africa. But international pressure does work. And I think if Israelis had to pay a cost, like if they suddenly had to have visas to go to European countries, if there was a cost to their government, the way it behaves, I think we could see change. So I think there has to be more and more pressure.
Well, already the pressure going on.
There is pressure,
Yeah.
but I think there needs to be more.
But it's still being protected.
Yeah. I don't know who's next. No one's telling me who's next. Okay, thank you.
Hi, thank you very much. A couple of things. I was just...
For a second.
Yeah, sure.
This is Janan Najib. She's the president of the Muslim Women's Coalition.
Oh, I've been wanting to meet you. Fantastic.
And she's also founder of the Wisconsin Coalition for Justice in Palestine.
Awesome.
Thanks. I'm just here kind of like enjoying your talk. Thank you very much. I'm just curious if you had, I did not see the source where you had, what was it, 86 to 87% of Israelis, what was that?
That was from Plus 972.
What was it?
Plus 972.
Oh,
It's
okay. And then
yeah,
also the one that said, that had the statistics as far as, 95% of them could care less about Gaza.
Right, this one?
Yeah.
I can send you those sources.
That would be great.
I'll give you my email, and I'm happy to
Yeah,
I love to share
wonderful.
sources.
Yeah.
So,
And I just did want to say just to the idea of like what can people do.
Yeah.
Of course, just keep working and making noise. But I don't know if you're aware of what happened in Milwaukee the other day when the police chief was confronted for having gone to train in Israel. And so for 3 hours, he was forced to listen to the community just blast him, basically. And so I think what really needs to happen is we need to be so aware of what's happening around us and make it a liability to be associated with Israel.
Yes.
So to the point that it really starts to affect the Israelis and it starts to affect the American Jews who then will, potentially have an effect. So I think that we hate to see this. This is a genocide. I mean, so many lives have been lost, but Unfortunately, it's a slow process, but we have to consistently show up and consistently make Israel a liability for everybody.
Absolutely. Was that at a town hall when they confronted?
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's.
That is a great point.
Yes,
Like,
exactly.
anytime a congressperson gives a town hall, we should be there.
Absolutely.
And we should confront them and say, do you believe in equal rights for Palestinians? That is something they should be able to say yes to, because that's supposed to be our value, right? I mean, or just like any other very simple questions that in any other context, it would be an easy question to answer, right? Like, I agree with you. I think town halls would be a great place.
And yesterday, a whole group of us went to Madison because the Senate is trying to pass the IRA definition.
Oh, God.
So what basically it claims to be defining anti-Semitism when in fact it's really criminalizing any criticism of Israel.
Yeah.
But what was phenomenal about it is that the mega senators introduced it as a way of protecting Jews, and that this is what the Jewish community wants. And 95% of the people that spoke, against this bill were in fact Jews.
That's great.
So I think again, it's such a diverse coalition that is against Israel, but it has to be consistent. Yeah.
Yeah. That's great.
Me? Okay. Getting back to Trump's Board of Peace, now I have seen several sources say that the UN did approve his plan.
Right.
And that even China and Russia did not veto it.
Right.
And that after Trump.
They abstained, yeah, they
They
abstained,
abstained,
yeah.
okay. But even after Trump is not president anymore, which can't happen soon enough, but he would still be leader
Right.
/ dictator, owner
Yeah.
of his own country.
Yes.
He would own Gaza, it would be his. And that he is asking, like you said, asking people to donate $1 billion to be a part of this,
Right.
to help develop it. He's got his piece of, son of Jared Kushner, designing this up. All along the coast would be luxury resorts, and then in the middle would be quarters for the slaves to do all the work. And on the eastern side would be data centers. And they would literally be building this on the top of Palestinian lives.
I know, it's devastating. I mean, and the other thing is with his, what came out at Davos last week or 10 days ago, now he wants to just make his Board of Peace the new Security Council, right? He just wants to like take over the UN.
Yeah.
And that's when that's when Europeans start caring, when Iceland is at stake instead of Gaza, right? So we can just hope to God that this doesn't happen. It's such a hairball scheme. I don't think it will, but it's very disheartening for sure.
Just to add to what you said, there was a very interesting editorial in the New York Times this morning written by a woman who points out that if you know who Peter Thiel is,
Ellen's here.
he has put in a financial, what can I call it, a financial haven in Honduras, in Roatan. So the billionaires want to do the same thing in Gaza. So it would be like we think of places in the Caribbean
Right.
that
Cayman
are
Islands.
tax havens,
Yes.
kind of like that. So it's not just Trump. It's
Yeah, you've got a corporate side to this
Peter
too.
Thiel,
Yeah.
It's the techno-billionaires.
techno-billionaires influencing Trump, and of course Kushner is right in there.
Designing, oh yeah.
Yeah, so it's quite a
He's scientist,
maze
so
that
Israel
we're
first.
dealing with.
Shall we have one last question?
Two.
One more.
We'll talk afterwards.
Okay, so I'll try to frame this right. So, I guess my question is, as far as us being optimistic about things, and then also us trying to find hopeful stuff. To me, part of the problem is, is that we spend a lot of time distancing ourselves from Hamas, from the resistance that's there on the ground. And I mean, quite frankly, we don't do that on Memorial Day, when all of our military has slaughtered people all across the world. We don't do it every time. 4th of July, we don't talk about Native Americans. Thanksgiving, we don't do that every single time that something comes up that we celebrate. We don't equivocate about all of the things.
Yeah.
So to me, it's like, our police kill in a year, as many people as were civilians that were killed by Hamas.
Right.
So the idea that we
Yeah.
have to do this every
Yeah.
time makes it so that we don't see that there are these people running around in sandals that are defeating this powerful military. And they have every right to armed resistance.
Yes.
So, I mean, we have to, to me, if we want to be hopeful about it, it has to start with the fact that there are all of these people on the ground in places like Gaza, in places like Venezuela, in places, that we are attacking, that are saying, no,
Exactly.
we're going to fight you and we're going to stay on our land. And, the more that we say Maduro is an authoritarian, or
Right.
whoever the Islamic Republic of Iran are mean to women, the more that we say these things, instead of defend the resistance that is doing our job for us. Because we can't stop our country from doing what it's doing. To me, I think, I don't know what you think.
No, it's true. As a Palestinian,
Right.
I'm a Palestinian whose parents lost their home and was abolished from Palestine. That's true. Because if the other people don't stand up for their land, for their home, they'll be out in dysphoria just like we are. So that makes total sense.
Yeah.
Because we are now Palestinians in dysphoria because of what happened in 1948 and what happened in 1967 and what's happening throughout this year.
Right.
I have family members and friends whose grandparents would go and pick their olives from olive groves and then have settlers come and attack them and get their legs and heads crashed in because they're just doing what they're supposed to be doing. Doesn't make any sense. So
Yeah.
this country was founded on revolution and people fighting for their rights, and Palestinians and other countries like Venezuelans are all only fighting for their rights, just as he said.
I think making parallels is really helpful. And also just trying to reverse it. How would you feel if another country came in and took your land and is bombing you? Just trying to put yourself in their shoes. Using empathy, I think, is super helpful. What would you do? Who would you support? What would you? How would you respond to that? And also the parallels, making the comparisons with other situations, I think is really helpful. And the other, with Iran, it's you can be supporting people of Iran and still not like their government. You can do both, right? You don't have to, just because you're supporting people in Iran and you don't want them to get bombed, doesn't mean you love the Islamic Republic.
I just feel though that, but even
Just pointing that out to
I just
people.
don't think that, I think that we should even stop saying that.
Yeah.
Because I don't
People
say,
don't know anything.
I don't say though, hi, I'm an American. Actually, I don't support the genocide of Native Americans. I was never in favor of slavery, and I don't and I don't like the way that, Obama deported more people than Trump so far overall, and I don't like Trump for doing, we don't do that. We just
I do that with Trump. I say I don't like Trump, but then I also have to say I don't like other politicians.
I'm just saying it doesn't, to me, it's we know that if Iran falls, it means the end of all of these things. And what points do we gain by saying I also don't like them? To me, it's just you're the only thing that the people that you're arguing with here is, oh, they don't like the government. You know what I mean? That's what they hear. And they don't hear the fact that hello, like, your government's been starving that government, and, you know, in the 50s, they took over from the people that you might like, and, like, put these people in power, like, you know, I mean, like, it's just, you can't explain it all, so to me, it's like, why do we even bother doing that? You know, like, I mean, so, I know that you're on a college campus, and, like, it's almost like a requirement to do that. So I forgive you for that. But like,
I gotta give I'm a historian too, so I have to.
Iran never invaded anybody.
I think that is a perfect thing to say. Which countries has Iran invaded? None, right? Like, I mean, literally none. And just to point out that, you know, Israel started bombing Iran and they were just defending themselves. I mean, I think basic facts are useful for people. Because a lot of people just don't, right? You guys are educated people, and you pay attention to things a lot of Americans are not paying attention, especially in international news. So I think pointing out basic important facts is helpful.
Just a
He
quick
has a
remark.
question.
Just a quick remark.
Yeah.
Netanyahu is funding Hamas.
He was, yeah. Yeah, and he's allowing them to get, you know, the money from Qatar and, yeah. I think that's useful to point out. Although, I mean, a lot of times, I feel like we should, like, explain that Hamas is like a national liberation organization. I think that's, and then I feel like that's an important thing to point out. I mean,
Hamas is from the people of Gaza. These are the people that lost so many family members, you know, so it's
absolutely.
like, they have a right to defend themselves.
Exactly.
And by any means necessary.
And no one else is doing it.
No,
By
but
any means necessary.
well, they're also the doctors and the
Yeah.
educators. I mean, like, you know, like,
Absolutely.
it's basically, you know, like, you, I mean, you're like,
It's
you're not
not just the
gonna
military,
approve
yeah.
like us bombing like the teachers union headquarters because it's like all of a sudden there's a Republican in power.
Right.
Like, I mean, it's, you just don't, that, it doesn't
My
make any
point
sense.
is simply that Hamas has been very demonized, and yet you have a demon funding the demon. I mean, I'm not
Yeah.
We
condemning.
have to also be honest that had it not been for Hamas, the Palestinians would have died a long time ago in Gaza. When we look at how many doctors, how many engineers, how many journalists, how many universities, that was built by Hamas. That was not built by.
I'm not taking that
you know,
away.
yeah.
I'm just saying the person in the street who gets the corporate news about the badness of Hamas, who doesn't know all that, doesn't realize probably that Netanyahu was.
He
He was doing it to
start
divide.
them as a counterweight to the Palestinian Authority. He's not supporting them now, but they, you know, in fact, Hamas is the only democratically really elected government of the Palestinians. They were the only democratically elected.
And also too, with Hamas,
Elected
also, the reason why you have to understand, when someone's mother and father were desecrated in front of them, you're gonna grow up to be a fighter, and you're
Yeah,
gonna
absolutely.
hunt. That's gonna be built in you.
Yeah.
I mean, that's
So-
why they've been able to replace all their fighters, because you have all these orphans
Yeah.
who just had their families killed. It's like, what else are they gonna do?
Yeah, because they want to get the justice that was taken
Right.
away, because they have a right to live, and people don't think that they have a right to live. And we have governments all over the world thinking that Palestinians don't have a right to live. That's why this genocide was for 2 years, and that large amount of our people. And it's very hard to watch when your own brothers and sisters are being desecrated and killed, and people don't flinch an eye.
Yeah.
And when a couple of Israeli soldiers get taken captive, the whole world turns into a chaos. So there is no justice, there's no human rights, there's
Right.
no.
Yeah.
It's hard to hear, it's hard to
Let's
watch.
officially finish for now, but we have snacks, we have cookies, we have crackers and cheese and hot tea. So please hang around. I don't know whether you want to hang around too
I
much,
can hang around a little bit.
as long as people.
penas. Guerrillero me llaman, hoy es justicia reclaman.